The building directory said, Floor 14, Suite 1402. And Eddie had been to that suite 47 times in the 2 years he had worked in this building, which meant he knew the walk from the lobby to the elevator bank without thinking about it, knew the third elevator on the left by the particular sound its doors made, knew the button panel by position and count. Ground, 2, 3. He pressed what should have been 14. It wasn't 14. He knew something was wrong before the doors opened. The scent of the elevator was different, cleaner, more expensive, carrying the faint trace of cedar and old wood that had nothing to do with the antiseptic and coffee smell of the medical floors below. But he had attributed this to maintenance, to the building crew that sometimes cycled through with different products, to the 1,000 small changes that occurred in shared spaces without announcement. He had filed it as irrelevant and stood with his cane tipped against the floor and his back to the mirrored wall and let himself have the thing he only allowed himself when he was alone. He hummed first. He always started with humming, the sound too small to travel, too private to constitute performance. Then, because the elevator's acoustic properties were extraordinary, that warm, contained resonance that certain enclosed spaces had, that natural amplification that turned a sound into something larger than itself, and because he was alone, because no one was listening, because this was the one place in his Tuesday afternoon where nothing was required of him, the hum opened. Not a song with words. Words implied an audience. This was something else, a melody he had been assembling in his head for weeks, building it the way you built something in the dark, by feel, by the sound of it, against the interior of the space where it lived. He had never played it for anyone. It had no name because naming it would have made it presentable, and it was not presentable. It was just what came out when everything else was off. The elevator opened. The scent hit him before the silence did cedar and wood smoke, and underneath both of those, something colder, sharper, the density of alpha presence in a concentrated space. Not one, 3. Triple-layered, powerful in the way of people who did not need to announce their authority because it was ambient. Eddie went silent mid-note. The silence in the hallway beyond the elevator doors was total, in a way that had nothing to do with emptiness. It was the silence of people who were very still. He did not move. Then a voice said, from directly ahead, carrying the particular quality of someone who is accustomed to being the first person to speak in any room, "Don't stop." The request was so wrong for the situation that Eddie did not immediately process it as a request. He processed it as interference with his exit, as an obstacle, and said with the clipped precision of someone who had spent 3 years making sure the world did not mistake his blindness for an invitation to handle him. "Excuse me," I pressed 14. "I'll get out of your way." "You're on the penthouse level," said a second voice, this one slightly warmer than the first, measured in the way of someone who had learned to be the room's moderator. "Private access only. There was a maintenance error this morning. The key card lock was disengaged." "You're not in trouble." A pause, and then, with the directness of someone who did not bother with transitions, "We heard you." Eddie's hand tightened on his cane. "That was private," he said. A third voice, the first one again, the direct one, said, "I know. I'm sorry. I had my phone out. I almost recorded it and then I stopped myself." Another pause. "I wanted you to know that I stopped myself." This was such a strange thing to say. Most people, when caught in a moment of potential violation, performed innocence. This one had disclosed what he had almost done wrong, unprompted, with the specific honesty of someone who considered it more important to be truthful about the almost than to avoid the discomfort of admitting it. Eddie stood in the elevator doorway and turned this information over. "The elevator won't wait forever," said the second voice, the measured one. "Come inside. I'll explain the layout. You can leave whenever you want." He was not in danger. He was practical. He was standing in an unfamiliar space with the doors open and 3 alphas whose scent his omega biology was already logging with more attention than he had given it permission to give. And the practical thing was to go inside rather than stand in a doorway. He stepped out of the elevator. The layout came to him through the second voice, Ryland. He would learn delivered in the specific format of someone who understood that information was more useful than guidance. The entrance hallway, 8 steps, opens left into a sitting room. The couch is at your 10 o'clock. He moved through it without assistance and sat down because the information was sufficient and he did not need more than that. The one who had almost recorded him, Danny, it turned out, brought coffee without being asked and set it on the low table in a position Eddie would have to reach slightly left to find. which was the wrong position, but he appreciated the attempt. Darius, the first voice, the one who had said times don't stop times with a certainty that Eddie was still processing, sat in the chair across from him and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "The maintenance error has been reported. It won't happen again," which was not what Eddie had been waiting for him to say, but which was also, he realized, listening to the careful precision of it, its own kind of apology. Not for hearing, for the circumstances that had made hearing possible without consent. "Why did you want me to keep going?" Eddie asked. He addressed the question to the room, rather than to any one of them, because he was not certain yet which voice belonged to which presence, and because the question felt like it belonged to all three of them equally. No one answered for a moment. Then Darius said, with the restraint of someone choosing words from a smaller set than the one available to him, "Because it was the most honest thing I've heard in years." Eddie absorbed this. He did not want to be moved by it. He was moved by it anyway. He stayed for 30 minutes, which was longer than he had intended and precisely as long as the coffee required. The three of them talked to him, not around him, not about him in the third person the way people sometimes talked about blind people in their presence, as if the blindness extended to hearing, but to him, with the direct address of people who understood that the person in the room was the one in the room. Danny asked questions that were genuinely curious rather than politely probing. Ryland explained things when explanation was useful and went quiet when it wasn't. Darius watched. Eddie could feel the quality of his attention, steady and total, the kind of watching that came from someone for whom observation was a primary mode of being in the world. When Eddie stood to leave, Ryland walked him back to the elevator, the private one, down to the lobby, which would require a manual override they arranged through the building manager. At the elevator, Ryland said, "We're on 14 and 15 as well, corporate floors. If you need anything, if the maintenance error created any problems for you, come find us." Eddie said, "I won't need anything." Ryland said, "I know, but the offer is there." In the lobby, Eddie stood for a moment with his cane and the particular weight of an afternoon that had become something other than what it was supposed to be. He had pressed the wrong button. He had been heard doing the thing he had been most careful for 3 years not to be heard doing. He walked back to the 14th floor, sat at his desk, put his headphones on, and transcribed 4 recordings with the meticulous attention he always gave the work, and did not once think about the fact that the melody he had been humming was still running on a quiet loop somewhere under everything else. He told himself he was not thinking about it. He stopped singing in the elevator. This was a smaller loss than it should have been, which meant it was also a larger one than he wanted to admit. The elevator had been his, not the space itself, which belonged to the building, but the acoustics of it. The specific, warm resonance of the enclosed metal box that had made the melody feel full and contained at once. He had not understood how much he had been counting on that Tuesday and Thursday elevator practice until he found himself standing in the lobby one Tuesday afternoon and taking the stairs instead. Not because the elevator was unavailable, but because stepping into it felt different now. Because the elevator was no longer an empty space. He knew they were 14 floors above him. He would have been the first to acknowledge, not great at pretending that information was less present than it was. He encountered Ryland first, on a Wednesday morning. He was navigating the lobby with the efficient autopilot of someone who had mapped every floor of this building into muscle memory. And Ryland said his name before he had registered who was near him, said it with the accuracy of someone who had identified him by sound, by footstep, or cane tap, or some combination of the two. Eddie. Not "excuse me" or "hi," but his name, which meant Ryland had been paying the kind of attention that generated a signature. "I can buy you coffee," Ryland said, which was not a question but not a command either, an offer laid flat in the space between them for Eddie to pick up or leave. "The lobby cafe. I'm going there now." Eddie had a transcription deadline. He went to the cafe. They sat for 20 minutes, and Ryland did not mention the elevator or the singing, which should have been a relief and instead created the alertness of waiting for something that didn't come. What Ryland talked about was a piece of music he had been trying to understand, a contemporary composition from a licensing submission that had been crossing his desk, and Eddie found himself explaining it. The structure of it, the way the piece used silence as a rhythmic element rather than as absence, and then found himself 20 minutes later having explained considerably more than he had intended to. Ryland listened with the total attention he apparently brought to everything. When Eddie finished, Ryland said, "That's exactly what I couldn't articulate about it. The silence isn't a pause. It's a note. He said this with the satisfaction of someone who had been carrying a question and had just had it answered. Then he paid for the coffee and left. Eddie sat with his empty cup for a moment. He went upstairs to his desk and told himself nothing had happened. Darius was at the building entrance 3 mornings later, standing in the cold air, checking something on his phone, and when Eddie came through the revolving door, Darius held the inner door open without looking up and said, "You're early today," with the conversational ease of someone noting a fact about a person they had been tracking. Eddie said, "Do you always stand in the entrance at this hour?" Darius said, "Yes," in a tone that made it clear this was not actually about the entrance, and then went back to his phone. And Eddie walked to the elevator bank thinking about the quality of that times, yes, times the way it was, not defensive, not performing casualness, just honest. Danny sent a message through the building's internal directory. This was, Eddie thought, reading it with the text-to-speech function of his phone, mildly inappropriate. The message said, "I've been thinking about what you were humming. I can't get it out of my head. Is there a name for it?" Eddie stared at the message, or rather, he had his phone repeat it 3 times, which was the functional equivalent. Then he typed back, "No name. It was mine." Danny's response arrived in 40 seconds. "I know. That's why I can't stop thinking about it." Eddie did not respond. He put his phone face down on his desk and went back to the transcription he had been working on, a piano piece that required careful attention, and he was careful and attentive, and he did not reply to Danny's message. And by the time he left the office that evening, the message had been sitting unanswered for 7 hours, and he was aware of it the way you were aware of a door that had not been opened, which was to say, constantly. He started taking his breaks in the lobby cafe at 4:30. This was, he told himself, because the afternoon light through the lobby windows was good, and he liked the ambient sound, and the coffee was reliable. The fact that Ryland also stopped at the cafe at 4:30, and that Darius sometimes appeared at 4:40, and that Danny had twice materialized at 4:50 with the slightly breathless quality of someone who had finished something early specifically to be somewhere none of this was, he told himself, the reason. He told himself this with decreasing conviction. The scent had been doing something to him since the elevator that he was managing with the same practical competence he applied to everything else. Cedar and wood smoke, all 3 of them carrying variations on the same bass note with distinct elements layered over it. Darius's wood smoke running cold and deep, Ryland's cedar warmer, Danny's carrying something brighter underneath. His Omega biology had been logging this composite signature since the elevator, and what it was doing with it was not something he could file under Times, irrelevant times anymore, which was irritating because he was good at filing things. He sang again for the first time in the stairwell on a Thursday evening. The building was almost empty. He had stayed late, finishing a complex transcription, and the late evening silence of the building had accumulated around him, the silence that encouraged the thing he had been keeping carefully locked. He took the stairs because he needed the movement, the physical rhythm of descent, and on the 3rd landing, with the building quiet around him and the stairwell holding its own particular echo, he let it happen. He did not know that Danny was 2 floors below him in the parking structure, finishing a call. He did not know that Danny heard it. He did not know that Danny stood completely still in the parking structure for the duration, not moving, barely breathing, and then went home and told his brothers. And that all 3 of them made the same decision separately. Don't say anything. Don't make him stop. Don't change the conditions under which it happens. The stairwell's acoustic properties were their information to withhold, and they withheld it, and this decision, which felt like protection, would eventually cost them the specific thing they had been protecting. But that was later. For now, Eddie took his 4:30 cafe breaks and answered Ryland's music questions and let Darius hold the building door and did not respond to Danny's message about the melody that had no name. And in the stairwell on Thursday evenings, with the building empty around him, the melody that had no name grew longer and fuller and closer to whatever it was trying to become. The fire drill happened on a Wednesday afternoon at precisely the worst possible time, which was mid-transcription during a section that required the full remainder of his working memory. The alarm was loud in the way building alarms were loud, not painful but insistent, the kind of sound that made thinking impossible and replaced it with the single instruction, move. Eddie saved his work, capped his headphones, picked up his cane, and went through the evacuation procedure he had mapped out in his 2nd week in the building. the stairwell, third floor landing. Exit to the forecourt. He had done this 3 times before, and each time his floor had evacuated without incident. The stairwell was more crowded than the previous drills. This was manageable. He was good at crowded spaces, better in some respects than sighted people, because he had learned to navigate by the sound of other bodies, the shift of air, the acoustic feedback of his cane against different surfaces. What was harder was the unpredictability of large groups, the way a crowd's movement had a logic that derived from what people could see rather than from any consistent physical signal. He navigated well through the first 3 floors. On the 3rd floor landing, a large group surged past a department he didn't recognize by sound, louder than the people from his floor, and someone's shoulder caught his, and for a moment he lost the wall. He was not in danger. He knew this. He could orient himself. He breathed, found the next surface with his cane, calculated his position from the sound of the crowd ahead and the distance to the exit below. He was fine. What he did not expect was a hand. It came from the left, from just above elbow height, and it arrived with an announcement, not a verbal one, but the announcement of a presence that had been approaching from that direction for several steps. The cedar and wood smoke of Ryland arriving before the touch. The hand did not grab, it did not redirect. It settled beside his, palm alongside his, fingers available, and Ryland's voice said, "Close, but not too close. The landing is 2 steps down on your right. The rail is clear." That was all. That was the entire intervention. Not times, "let me help you" times, or "times I've got you" times, or the half-dozen other things well-meaning people said when they saw Eddie's cane and decided he required management. Just the information 2 steps down, rail is clear, delivered as data, as the content that his navigation needed, with his own movement left entirely to him. He descended the 2 steps, he found the rail, he continued to the exit. On the forecourt, in the cold air and the mild chaos of 300 people standing in the wrong places, he felt Ryland stop beside him, not pressing. Just there, and after a moment felt the other 2 arrive. The composite scent assembling itself in the autumn air. Darius, scanning the crowd with the systematic attention of someone running a safety check. Danny, on the phone with someone, managing something with the clipped efficiency that was apparently his default mode. He was still processing the stairwell hand, the restraint of it, the understanding it demonstrated of what help actually meant for him, specifically when Danny finished his call and said something that wasn't to Eddie. He was humming in the stairwell on Thursday. The sentence was aimed at his brothers, but the forecourt was not a controlled acoustic environment. Eddie went still. Danny turned toward him. There was a pause, a short one, the length of someone arriving at a decision, and then Danny said, with the directness that Eddie had come to understand was not carelessness, but simply his particular form of honesty, "I should have told you. I was in the parking structure. I heard you and I didn't say anything because I didn't want to change it, and that was wrong. I should have told you the stairwell carries sound." The silence between them held the weight of something being rearranged. "How many times?" Eddie asked. Danny said, "Twice." Then, without being asked, "I didn't record it either time." Darius, from Eddie's left, said, "The stairwell acoustics are an engineering property of the building. We should have told you when we understood how sound travels through it." Eddie stood in the cold forecourt and held all of this. 2 times, in what he had believed was a private space, heard without his knowledge. The same violation as the elevator, replicated. And yet the quality of the disclosure, immediate, specific, without hedging, was different from how people usually handled having done something wrong. Most people softened it. These 3 had reported it with the precision of a factual accounting. "I need you to tell me," he said, "in the future, if you hear me. I need to know when I'm being heard." Ryland said, "Yes," with the simplicity of someone making an actual commitment. Eddie thought about the stairwell hand. The 2 steps down, rail is clear. He thought about Ryland at the lobby cafe, saying times the silence isn't a pause, it's a note, times with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting to understand something. He thought about Darius holding the building door and saying, "Times you're early today, times with that honest economy." "Why didn't you just leave?" he asked. He was not angry, which surprised him. He had expected to be angry. "Either time, when you heard me, why not just go?" There was a pause in which all 3 of them clearly had the same answer and were waiting to see who would say it. Danny said it because Danny always said the true thing, because it would have felt like leaving something important. The alarm stopped. The forecourt began its shuffle back toward the entrance, the building restoring itself to its working configuration. Eddie moved with the crowd, his cane finding the familiar pavement, and beside him Ryland walked at exactly the right distance, close enough to be present, far enough to leave him room. Back at his desk, headphones on, transcription open, Eddie sat for a long time before pressing play. He was thinking about the Stairwell hand, the information delivered without the taking over, the competence of knowing what help meant for someone without having been told. He pressed play. He worked. He did not stop thinking about it. The weeks after the fire drill settled into something that didn't have a name but had a shape. The 4:30 cafe breaks continued. The conversation widened from music and the building and practical things into other things. The gradual accumulation of information that happened when four people spent enough time in proximity to become known to each other. Eddie learned that Ryland had been trying to understand music for years without anyone explaining it in terms that made sense to him, and that Danny had a particular quality of attention that looked like distraction and was actually acute focus, and that Darius communicated most clearly through what he did rather than what he said. He also learned, in the indirect way that people learned things about themselves through how other people responded to them, that his way of moving through the world, the systems he had built, the navigation, the ordered efficiency of a person who could not afford to leave things where they did not belong, was something they found not pitiable, but admirable. Not in the performed way of people who announce their admiration for disabled people as a form of congratulating themselves. In the quiet way of people who simply registered a fact. Darius said once, with his characteristic economy, "You know this building better than most of the people who work here." Eddie said, "I've had to." Darius said, "That's not the same as what I said." It wasn't. Eddie sat with that distinction for several days. Danny commissioned software for him. This happened without announcement. One morning, there was a message with a download link and a note that said only, "For the background noise problem." Eddie had mentioned, 2 weeks prior, that a particular transcription was giving him difficulty because the original recording had ambient interference he couldn't filter cleanly. He had mentioned it once, in passing, in the lobby cafe. Danny had apparently gone and commissioned a custom tool. Eddie sat with the software open on his desk and thought about the architecture of that gesture, its precision, the way it required not just attention but memory and then action, the absence of any request for acknowledgement. He typed back, "Thank you." Danny replied, "You're welcome." Eddie replied, "You didn't have to." Danny replied, "I know." The brevity of it, the absence of any "but I wanted to," or "it was nothing," or any of the softening moves that turned gifts into claims. Just times I know, which contained everything and asked for nothing. Eddie stared at the screen for a long time after that. End of parts 1 through 3. Ryland asked 2 months after the elevator, on an evening when the cafe had emptied around them and neither of them had moved to leave. He asked the way he asked most things, without preamble but without pressure either. The question laid flat in the space between them like something he had been holding for a while and had decided it was time to set down. Would you ever sing for someone on purpose? Eddie had been turning his empty cup in his hands, a habit he had developed after losing his sight because the small physical repetition helped him think. He set it down. "I don't know what it would be if it was on purpose," he said. Ryland waited. He was good at waiting, not the performative patience of someone demonstrating that they were not rushing you, but the genuine stillness of a person who understood that silence was sometimes the most useful thing available. "When I sing," Eddie said, and then stopped, because he had not tried to articulate this before, and the articulation was harder than the fact of it. It's not making something. It's not even really about music, technically. It's what happens when I'm not managing anything. When there's no one to navigate around or compensate for or be perceived by." He turned the cup in his hands again. "It's just what comes out when everything else is off." He heard the quality of the air change in the way it changed when someone understood something completely. Not a sound, not a visible reaction, just the particular alteration in the room that happened when information landed correctly. "So you've never sung in front of anyone," Ryland said. "Not since I was a kid. Before the accident, before everything became a navigation problem, before being perceived was something that had stakes." A pause. Then Ryland said, "What would it take?" Eddie thought about this honestly, which meant he thought about it for a while before answering. I'd have to trust that being heard wouldn't change anything, he said. That what I was doing would still be what I was doing. That I wouldn't become aware of being heard and close up around it. Ryland didn't offer reassurance. This was the right choice. Eddie would have known reassurance for what it was, a social lubricant, a performance of confidence designed to ease the moment, and he would have filed it as irrelevant. What Ryland said instead was, "Then we have time." 2 words, the entire architecture of patience built into them. Eddie went home that evening and sat in his apartment with the window open and thought about those 2 words. Then we have time. Not times we'll be careful, times or times we promise not to react, times both of which would have been about them, about their behavior, about assurances he could not verify. Then we have time. Times was about time itself, about the difference between waiting for something and simply existing alongside someone until the conditions became what they needed to be. He opened his window and sat in the chair he used when he wanted to think, and after a while, because the evening was warm and his apartment was empty and the city below was making its ambient sound, he hummed. Just that. Just the melody that still didn't have a name, the one that had been developing in his head since the elevator opened and found 3 people waiting. He noticed, for the first time, that it had gotten longer. The 4 of them were learning each other. This was not a dramatic process. It happened in the space of cafe breaks and shared building hours and the gradual accumulation of information that came from being in proximity with the same people long enough that their patterns became legible. Eddie learned Darius through the things he did rather than the things he said. The door held in the mornings had become the door held reliably. The building's structural things that had been quietly improved in the past 6 weeks. The stairwell's handrail reinstalled at a slightly different height. The lobby cafe's counter rearranged, so the pickup position required less lateral movement for someone with a cane had been done without announcement and without acknowledgement sought. Eddie had not connected these improvements to Darius until the morning Darius mentioned, in the economical way he mentioned most things, that the building management company had been sent a set of accessibility recommendations. From who? Eddie asked. From us, Darius said. From the Voss Group. We lease a significant amount of floor space. The management company is responsive to our concerns. Eddie stood at the building entrance with the cold morning air on his face and processed this. The management company was responsive to their concerns. Their concern had been the counter position and the handrail height, and presumably other things Eddie had been navigating around for 2 years without expecting them to change. You didn't tell me you were doing that, he said. No, Darius agreed. The quality of the agreement was not defensive, it was simply honest about what had been a choice. I thought you might not want it framed as something done for you. I thought you'd prefer it as a building-wide improvement. Eddie considered this. You were right, he said. That's an important distinction. Darius said nothing, but the quality of his silence had the particular texture of someone receiving something they had hoped for. Ryland, Eddie came to understand, was a translator not of languages, but of people. He had the intelligence of someone who understood the gap between what a person said and what they meant, and who moved through that gap with precision rather than presumption. In the cafe, he would sometimes say, after one of Eddie's more compressed observations, "So what you mean is," and then complete the thought in a way that was more fully articulated than Eddie had managed himself, and Eddie would sit with the completed version and think, "Yes, that. That is what I meant." Having someone who could do that was, he discovered, a real kind of relief. It meant that being compact was not the same as being unclear. Danny was the most surprising. Eddie had categorized Danny early as the direct one, the one who said true things without softening them, and this was accurate. What he had not anticipated was the accompanying quality, the care underneath, the directness, the way the true things were delivered without any interest in the impact of their truth being weaponized. Danny said difficult things plainly, not because he was careless with them, but because he understood that plain delivery was more respectful than managed delivery. Managed delivery implied the other person couldn't handle the truth. Plain delivery implied they could. He also made Eddie laugh. This was unexpected, and became, over the weeks, something Eddie looked forward to in the way you looked forward to things you hadn't been expecting to find. The scent through all of this was doing what it was doing. Eddie had stopped trying to file it under manageable and had started simply acknowledging it as a fact, the way you acknowledged weather, the way you acknowledged a structural load-bearing element that was present regardless of whether you were thinking about it. Cedar and wood smoke, triple-layered and distinct, present in the lobby and in the cafe and in the stairwell and in the building's shared air. His Omega biology had made its own calculations about what this scent signature meant and was not going to be persuaded otherwise. He was not, he told himself, going to be rushed by his own biology. His biology was, it turned out, not concerned with whether he was being rushed. He invited them on a Saturday. This required more deliberation than he wanted to admit. His apartment was the space most thoroughly organized around his way of moving through the world, the arrangement of every object chosen for maximum navigability, the kitchen ordered by a system that would have looked arbitrary to a sighted person and was in fact precise. Having other people in it meant having their perceptions of it, which meant having their perceptions of him in the most revealing possible context. He invited them anyway, because Rylan had been struggling with a piece of music for 3 weeks, and Eddie had finally determined that explaining it verbally was insufficient and it needed to be demonstrated. This was the stated reason. He was honest with himself about the difference between the stated reason and the actual one. They arrived together, which he had expected, and they came in with varying degrees of ease. Danny said, immediately upon entering, "You could navigate this blindfolded," and then laughed at himself. And Eddie felt the laugh land in his chest, in the particular way Danny's laughs tended to, slightly wrong-footed, entirely genuine. Rylan moved through the space with the careful attention of someone committing a layout to memory. Darius took it in with the assessing stillness he brought to everything, and Eddie felt that assessment not as an intrusion but as the specific quality of someone understanding the architecture of a space as an expression of the person who lived in it. He played the piece for Ryland on his laptop, described the notation, walked through the structure. Ryland sat close to the speaker with the focused attention of someone who had decided that if he was going to understand something, he was going to understand it correctly. Danny asked questions that were intelligent and slightly tangential in the way of someone whose mind moved by association rather than sequence. Darius listened and said nothing, which Eddie had learned was not disengagement but the fullest form of attention Darius had. When the explanation was done, the apartment had the quality of an evening that had satisfied its stated purpose and had more evening left in it. None of them moved toward the door. The warmth of the space, his lamp, his window, the city below making its Friday night sounds, held them all in a mutual stillness that Eddie recognized, somewhere in the back of his mind. As the condition he had described to Ryland 2 months ago, nothing being required, no navigation, no compensation, he started humming, not deliberately. The way he always started the hum slipping out of the space where the management lived because the management had relaxed, because the space felt safe, because the particular acoustic of his apartment in the evening with warm light and people he trusted was close enough to the elevator's enclosed resonance that his body made the same decision it made in enclosed empty spaces. 4 notes in, he became aware of what he was doing. He stopped. The apartment was completely quiet. "Don't apologize," Ryland said, from the couch to his left, with the quiet certainty of someone who had thought about this moment and knew exactly what the correct thing to say was. Eddie sat with the stopped melody and the warmth of the room and the 3 presences arranged around him and felt the distance between this and the elevator, felt it as a physical measurement. In the elevator he had been alone. He had believed he was alone. The privacy of it was structural, not chosen. Here he was not alone, and he had chosen to be here, and the management had come down anyway because the people in the room were the conditions under which it came down. "That's the elevator one," Danny said. Not a question, a recognition. His voice had gone quieter than usual, the quiet of someone handling something carefully. "Yes," Eddie said. From across the room, Darius said, "You don't have to stop." The phrasing of it. Not times please continue, not times we want to hear it, not any request that would have put the weight of their wanting onto him. Just, you don't have to stop. The removal of a barrier rather than the addition of a pressure, the difference between opening a door and pushing someone through it. Eddie sat with the melody inside him, the one that had been developing for months now, longer than it had been developing before the elevator, grown in the conditions of the past 10 weeks into something fuller than what had started, and he felt the precise dimensions of what Ryland had said 2 months ago. Then we have time. They had been here, all this time, not waiting for him to perform something but simply being here until the conditions became what they needed to be. He sang, not the elevator version, the full version, the one that had accumulated everything since that Tuesday afternoon. It was longer now. It had developed sections that had not existed in the elevator, passages that had grown from the 4:30 cafe conversations and the stairwell evenings, and the Saturday morning when Ryland had held his hand on the fire drill landing and said, 2 steps down, rail is clear, and let him move himself. It had the shape of the past 10 weeks built into it, the emotional architecture of people learning each other, rendered in the only medium Eddie had ever processed the world's emotional content through. He sang it all the way through. The apartment was completely quiet when he finished. Not the charged silence of people waiting to respond, the silence of people who had received something and were letting it settle before they moved it. That's what it is when it's on purpose, he said. Darius said, from across the room, with the specific economy of a man choosing the most precise words from a very large set. It's the same. Eddie said, what? It sounds exactly like the elevator. Darius paused, still unguarded. Still exactly what it was when you thought you were alone. Another pause, the particular quality of someone arriving at the final version of a thought they had been working on for a long time. I don't think there's a version of this that performs. I think you're only capable of being exactly what you are when you sing. The audience doesn't change it. The silence that followed had a different texture from the silence that had come before. It was the silence of someone hearing the most accurate thing that had ever been said about them and not yet knowing what to do with that accuracy. That's terrifying, Eddie said. Ryland's hand found his on the couch cushion, not asking for anything, just placing itself there, the same quality as the stairwell, information rather than intervention. We know, he said. We're not going anywhere. Danny, from the floor where he was sitting with his back against the couch, said, we've been here for 10 weeks, and we haven't moved. Eddie looked at the particular darkness that was his evening apartment with 3 people in it and felt, somewhere in the center of his chest, the pressure of something that had been building since a Tuesday in a private elevator and had finally found the form it had been looking for. I know, he said. He told Ryland first. Not as a declaration, Eddie did not do declarations. He did statements of information, clearly delivered, without performance. They were at the lobby cafe on a Wednesday evening, the last people there, the cafe winding down around them, and Eddie said, I think I've known for a while, about the bond. Ryland was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was letting something arrive fully before he responded. Then he said, we've known since the elevator. Why didn't you say anything? Eddie asked. Ryland turned his cup on the table, a habit Eddie had learned, that meant he was choosing his words carefully. Because knowing it and being ready for it aren't the same thing, he said, and we didn't want to put the weight of our certainty on you before you'd had time to arrive at your own. Eddie thought about this. What if I'd never been ready? Then we'd still be here. Ryland said it plainly, without making it into something large. In this cafe at 4:30, Danny sending you software. Darius having the building management rearrange the counter. We weren't waiting for you to become ready. We were just being here until you were. Eddie sat with the quality of that, the difference between waiting and simply existing alongside someone with no conditions attached. He had encountered the conditional kind of patience before, the kind that was really just deferred expectation wearing patience's face. This was not that. He had been watching for 10 weeks to see if the patience had an expiration, and it had not. That's a very patient way to love someone, he said. Ryland said, without any hesitation at all, you're worth being patient for. The simplicity of it, the absence of any qualifier or softening or performance of the sentiment, just the fact, delivered plainly, as Ryland delivered all facts. Eddie told Darius the following morning at the building entrance. Darius received it with the stillness he brought to significant information, letting it arrive fully before responding. Then he said, I've been certain since the elevator. I didn't know what to do with that certainty except build things around you until you could feel it yourself. The accessibility improvements, Eddie said. Among other things, Darius said. He held the door open, and they went inside together, and Eddie felt the shape of the past 10 weeks differently, felt the counter at the cafe, the handrail height, the software. The morning door not as separate gestures, but as a single, sustained one. The architecture of a person who showed love by making the world more navigable for the person they loved. Danny, he told in the lobby, in passing, because that was how Danny communicated, in the interstices of other things, in the spaces between. He simply said, as Danny was coming out of the elevator, "I've been thinking about what you said, about the melody, that you can't stop thinking about it because it was mine." Danny stopped walking. "I've been thinking the same thing about you," Eddie said. "All three of you." Danny was quiet for a long moment. Then, with the directness that was his most consistent quality, "Good. Just that. Good." And then, after a beat, "It's about time, honestly." Eddie laughed the full, genuine laugh that Danny had been eliciting from him for months, the one that arrived when the thing was true and perfectly timed. "I know," he said. "I was getting there." "You were always getting there," Danny said. "We just had to wait for you to know it." The evenings in Eddie's apartment became a different kind of thing after that. They came separately and together, fitting themselves into his space with the naturalness of people who had decided it was theirs to be in. Darius arrived one Saturday morning and stood in the kitchen watching Eddie navigate it with the precision he brought to everything, and then quietly rearranged two things to make a repeated sequence smoother, and asked before doing it, "May I?" and waited for the yes. Rylan brought a speaker that worked with Eddie's audio systems and spent an afternoon integrating it, talking through the process as he worked. The narration of someone who understood that presence and explanation were the same form of attentiveness. Danny came at random hours with the unpredictability of someone for whom routine was a concept that applied to other people, and he sat on the floor and asked questions and made Eddie laugh, and occasionally, in the evening, sat close enough that the cedar and smoke of his scent was a constant presence. The bond was building the way bonds built through proximity and choice and the repeated decision of all four of them to be in the same space together. Eddie could feel it in the way that Omegaverse biology made things felt, a warmth in his chest that had three distinct directions, three presences he could locate without sight, three emotional signatures that were becoming as legible to him as their voices. He did not resist it. He had spent 10 weeks moving toward this with the deliberate pace of someone who would not be rushed, and now that he had arrived, he found that the arrival felt less like a change and more like a clarification of something that had already been true. The marking happened on a quiet evening in his apartment. No ceremony, no announcement. He had been on the couch with the window open and the city below making its evening sound, all three of them arranged around him in the configuration they had developed over months, Darius in the chair across from him, Rylan beside him, Danny on the floor, and the melody had come, the way it always came now when the management was down. And he had sung it through, and the apartment had settled into its familiar post-melody quiet. Then Eddie said, "I want to complete the bond." Not a question, not a request, a statement of what he wanted, delivered with the directness he had learned from watching Danny for months. "This is what I want." He had decided it, and he was saying it, clearly, without softening. Darius crossed the room and sat beside him. His hand, warm and large and steady, came to rest against the side of his neck, careful, asking with the pressure of it rather than the question. Eddie leaned into it. "Yes," he said. Darius marked first. The bond mark settled into place with the sensation Eddie had no prior reference for, not pain, not exactly, but a pressure and a warmth, and then, afterward, the sudden presence of something new. Darius in his chest, a presence carrying the quality of cedar and depth, and a steadiness that Eddie had been reading through doors and building improvements, and the particular quality of a door held at exactly the right moment. Now it was inside him. Now he could feel it directly. Ryland second. And Ryland's mark had the quality of everything Ryland had been to him. Information delivered without the taking over, presence without pressure, the warmth of someone who had held his hand on a stairwell landing and said 2 steps down, rail is clear, and left them moving to him. Danny last, with the directness that was his constant mode, certain and present and the truest thing in the room, always. When Danny's mark settled, Eddie felt the bond complete, the 3 threads converging into the full weight of what they had been building towards since a Tuesday afternoon in a private elevator. He sat for a moment with all 3 of them and the warmth of the completed bond and the city outside his window making it sound. "I can feel you all being relieved," he said. 10 weeks, Danny said. from somewhere to his right, with the aggrieved tone of someone whose patience had been thoroughly tested. 10 weeks of being very reasonable. Ryland laughed. It was, Eddie thought, the best thing about Ryland, the way his laugh arrived, full and genuine, in the moments that deserved it. Darius said, with his characteristic economy, worth it. Worth it, Eddie agreed. The melody finished itself on a Thursday evening in November. Eddie had been aware for weeks that it was close, the way you were aware of a building nearing completion, the structural work done, and the remaining details becoming visible. He had been filling in the final passages in the evenings, sitting in the chair by the window while the city below made its autumn sounds, working through the last sections with the patience of someone who understood that forcing a conclusion was how you made something wrong. He was not alone when it finished. This was fitting. Darius was in the kitchen making the dinner he had been making on Thursday evenings for 6 months, having decided early in the year that Thursday was his domain and pursued its domination with the systematic thoroughness he brought to everything. Ryland was on the couch with a music licensing submission spread across his lap, running the new notation through the understanding he had been building for a year with Eddie's help. Occasionally saying something that required a response, and occasionally going quiet in the comfortable way that people went quiet in spaces they had decided were theirs. Danny was on the floor, back against the couch, working on something on his laptop with the focused energy of a person in motion even while sitting still. The melody came through the window of the chair by the window, the way it always came, the management down, the conditions right, the warmth of the space that had grown over the course of a year, to contain all 5 of them without any of the original arrangement needing to change. Eddie's apartment, his navigation system, his kitchen logic, his lamp and his window and his chair. They had come into it and they had not tried to reshape it. They had simply been present in it until it was theirs as well as his, in the way that spaces became shared without the original owner losing their claim. He sang the melody through from the beginning. It took 12 minutes. It was the longest it had ever been, the accumulated weight of a year of being with these 3 people. All of it inside the music, all of it in the form that was his natural language for the world's emotional content. The cafe breaks and the fire drill landing and Danny's times, I know times, and Ryland's times, then we have times, and Darius's times. It sounds exactly like the elevator. The stairwell evenings and the software and the handrail and the first time on purpose and the marking and the 6 months of Thursday dinners. All of it, in the melody, in the precise and wordless form that had no name because it had always been only theirs. When it finished, the apartment was quiet. Then Danny said, from the floor, without looking up from his laptop, "That was the whole thing." "Yes," Eddie said. Ryland turned a page in the submission he was reviewing and said, without looking up, "It's done." "It's done," Eddie agreed. Darius appeared in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What's it called?" Eddie thought about this. He had been carrying the melody for over a year and had never given it a name because naming it would have made it presentable, and it was not presentable. It had never been for anyone. It had never been a performance. It had been exactly what it had been in the elevator, what it had always been. What Darius had said it was, just what came out when everything else was off. But a year was not the same as before. The conditions were different now. Being heard was not the same as it had been. "I don't know," he said. "Something." Danny looked up from his laptop. "Ours," he said, with the simplicity of the correct answer. "Just call it ours." Eddie sat with the word. Ours. A year ago, in a private elevator with the doors opening onto 3 people he had not expected, the melody had been entirely his only, his private, his unguarded self in the one space where he had been certain no one was listening. Now it was done, and it was still unguarded, and it was still exactly what it had always been, and it was also theirs, because that was what happened when you were heard by people who received what they heard correctly. You did not lose the thing. It became larger. "Ours," he said. From the kitchen, Darius said, "Dinner in 10 minutes. Ryland set down his submission. Danny closed his laptop. Eddie sat in his chair by the window and felt all 3 of them in his chest, the triple warmth of the completed bond, distinct and familiar, and felt the city below making its Thursday evening sound, and felt the apartment around him, which was his apartment, and also theirs, which was the same thing, in the way that things that were shared without conditions became the same thing. He had pressed the wrong button a year ago. He had been 47 times to the 14th floor, suite 1402, and had known the elevator bank by feel and habit and had pressed the wrong button, and the elevator had opened onto the penthouse level, and 3 alphas had heard something he had never meant to share. And then they had been careful with it. And then they had waited. And then, over 10 weeks of cafe breaks and stairwell acoustics and building improvements and a software tool for background noise and a hand on a fire drill landing, he had trusted them enough to sing on purpose. And then, over the months that followed, the melody had continued becoming what it was becoming. He had not known. Standing in the elevator with the doors opening and the scent hitting him cedar and wood smoke, triple layered, powerful that the song would end here. In his apartment, in the November evening, with Darius making dinner and Ryland reviewing submissions and Danny on the floor, with all of them easy in his space, all of them known to him in the way that people became known when there was enough time and enough honesty, he had pressed the wrong button. The melody was done. Both things were true, and both of them, in the end, were the same thing.